The runway stretched endlessly under the scorching desert sun, heat waves dancing off cracked asphalt as sand whipped through the air. A line of male pilots stood at attention, their confidence radiating like the brutal Arizona heat. One young woman stood apart, silent and overlooked. The colonel's smirk cut through the tension. "Any jet will do." Laughter erupted. Nobody believed she could even take off, let alone land first. But when the dust settled and engines went silent, her A-10 Warthog was the first bird back on the ground. Where in the world are you watching this from? What would be your first emotion if you found yourself in this situation? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to follow this incredible journey. Elena Carter stood 5'6" in steel-toed boots, her angular face set in determined lines that betrayed none of the doubt gnawing at her insides. At 26, she carried herself with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime proving she belonged in spaces that weren't designed for her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it could have passed military inspection, and her gray eyes held a steely resolve that most people mistook for arrogance. She was the daughter of Robert Carter, a brilliant aerospace engineer whose innovative turbine designs had revolutionized commercial aviation in the 1990s. Elena had grown up in hangars that smelled of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, falling asleep to the distant thunder of engines being tested on midnight runs. Her earliest memories were of watching her father's hands move over complex blueprints, explaining aerodynamics principles to a curious little girl who absorbed every word. But the aviation world had never been kind to the Carter family. Robert's most groundbreaking innovations had been stolen by larger corporations, his patents buried in legal battles he couldn't afford to fight. He died when Elena was 19, bitter and forgotten, his contributions erased from industry history. On his deathbed, he'd gripped her hand with surprising strength and whispered, "The sky remembers, even when people don't. Make it remember you." Now standing on the flight line at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Elena felt the weight of that promise pressing against her chest. She was one of only 3 women in the Advanced Tactical Aircraft program, and the only one assigned to the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the legendary Warthog that most pilots considered a flying tank rather than a true fighter aircraft. The morning briefing had been a masterclass in institutional humiliation. Colonel Marcus Webb, a 30-year veteran with silver hair, and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd stared down MiGs over hostile territory, had surveyed assembled pilots with the casual dismissiveness of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. "Today's exercise is simple," he'd announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Combat approach and landing under simulated battlefield conditions. Wind shear, limited visibility, hostile fire simulation. The kind of conditions you'll face when lives depend on your ability to put your aircraft exactly where it needs to be." His pale blue eyes had swept across the room, lingering on each pilot's face before settling on Elena with something that might have been amusement. "Equipment assignments have been made based on pilot capabilities and aircraft availability." A pause that seemed to last forever. "Any jet will do, after all." The room had erupted in laughter. Not the good-natured ribbing that characterized most military humor, but something sharper and more cutting. Captain Jake Morrison, a former Navy pilot with movie star looks and an ego to match, had actually slapped his knee. "Jesus, Colonel, you're gonna put her in the hog? That thing weighs more than my car. Maybe we should get her a flight simulator instead," another voice had called from the back. "Safer for everyone involved." Elena had remained perfectly still throughout the exchange, her pen gripped so tightly in her right hand that her knuckles had gone white. She'd learned long ago that reactions were weapons that could be used against her, so she gave them nothing. No tears, no anger, no defensive protests, just the kind of stoic silence that made her tormentors work harder for their satisfaction. But inside, something had shifted. The humiliation wasn't new. She'd endured worse during her years at the Air Force Academy, where being one of the few women meant carrying the combined expectations and prejudices of an entire institution. What was new was the particular quality of dismissiveness in Colonel Webb's voice, the casual assumption that her presence was more about political correctness than actual capability. That night, alone in her quarters, Elena had stared at a framed photo of her father standing beside his prototype engine design. His expression in the picture was one of quiet pride, the look of a man who understood that true innovation often came disguised as something the establishment wasn't ready to recognize. She'd made a promise to that photograph, the same promise she'd made to herself every day since arriving at Davis Monthan. Tomorrow, everything would change. The weeks leading up to the final evaluation had been a relentless cycle of doubt, determination, and small humiliations that accumulated like paper cuts on her confidence. Elena's training scores were solid, consistently in the top 15% of her class. But solid wasn't extraordinary, and extraordinary was the only thing that would silence the whispers that followed her through the corridors. Her relationship with the A-10 Thunderbolt II had started as mutual skepticism. The Warthog wasn't a glamorous aircraft. Built around a massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon that could fire depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute, it was designed for close air support rather than air-to-air combat. Other pilots called it ugly, slow, and outdated, a flying artillery piece that belonged in a museum rather than modern combat scenarios. But Elena found something almost meditative about the A-10's brutish honesty. Unlike the sleek F-16s and F-15s that her male colleagues coveted, the Warthog made no pretense of elegance. It was pure function, built to absorb tremendous damage while delivering devastating firepower to support ground troops. There was something appealing about an aircraft that had been written off by aviation purists, but continued to prove its worth in the harshest conditions imaginable. The flight simulator sessions had been brutal. Elena spent countless hours in the cramped cockpit mock-up, running scenarios that seemed designed to highlight every possible weakness. Night operations with limited visibility, emergency landings with simulated engine failures, combat approaches under fire while navigating through electronic countermeasures that turned her instruments into a chaotic light show. Her scores improved incrementally, but improvement felt glacial when measured against the expectations surrounding her. Captain Morrison continued to excel in the F-16 simulations, his natural reflexes and aggressive flying style earning praise from instructors who saw him as the program's obvious success story. During debrief sessions, Elena noticed how the feedback differed. Morrison's mistakes were framed as aggressive decision-making or pilot initiative, while her errors were cataloged with clinical precision. The psychological pressure was constant and exhausting. Elena found herself second-guessing decisions that would have been instinctive for other pilots, her confidence eroded by the persistent suggestion that she was an affirmative action placeholder rather than a legitimate candidate. Sleep became elusive as her mind replayed every simulation, every critique, every moment of doubt that flickered across an instructor's face. Late at night, when the base was quiet and the Arizona desert stretched endlessly under star-filled skies, Elena would walk to the flight line and sit beneath the A-10's wing. The aircraft's titanium bathtub, the armored cockpit designed to protect pilots from ground fire, felt solid and reassuring in the darkness. She'd run her hands along the titanium panels, feeling the material's incredible strength and remembering her father's voice explaining the metallurgy principles that made such protection possible. "Every piece of metal tells a story," he'd said during one of their weekend garage sessions, where he'd taught her to understand engines through touch as much as sight. "Steel has a voice if you know how to listen. Titanium sings differently than aluminum. A healthy engine has a rhythm you can feel in your bones." Those lessons became Elena's secret advantage. While other pilots relied heavily on digital displays and computer-assisted diagnostics, she developed an intuitive relationship with her aircraft's mechanical systems. She could detect subtle changes in engine performance through vibrations transmitted through the control stick. She knew when hydraulic pressure was dropping slightly before the gauges registered the change. Her maintenance crew began to notice that she caught potential problems earlier than pilots with more flight hours. But technical competence wasn't enough to overcome institutional bias. During a particularly brutal evaluation flight, Elena had executed a perfect emergency landing procedure after simulated hydraulic failure, bringing the A-10 down safely despite challenging crosswinds. The debrief had focused not on her successful crisis management, but on whether her initial response time had been optimal. "Hesitation kills pilots," the instructor had noted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen friends die from split-second delays. "Combat doesn't give you time to think. It demands instinctive reactions." Elena had nodded and accepted the feedback without argument. But privately, she wondered whether her measured decision-making was being mistaken for hesitation. Her father had taught her that the best engineers weren't the fastest thinkers, but the most thorough ones. Problems that seemed simple often had complex underlying causes that revealed themselves only to patient observation. The night before the final evaluation, Elena couldn't sleep. She'd walk to the flight line again, drawn by the comfort of her A-10's familiar silhouette. The desert air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of night training exercises. She climbed up the crew ladder and settled into the cockpit, running through her pre-flight checklist in the darkness. "Tomorrow," she'd whispered to the empty cockpit, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. "Tomorrow I prove that slow and steady doesn't mean weak. Tomorrow I show them that listening to the machine makes you stronger, not slower." Her hands had moved over the controls with practiced familiarity, each switch and gauge positioned exactly where muscle memory expected to find it. The A-10 might not be the most sophisticated aircraft in the Air Force inventory, but it was hers, and tomorrow she would make it sing. Dawn broke over Davis-Monthan Air Force Base with the kind of crystalline clarity that Arizona mornings were famous for, but by 0800 hours, conditions had begun to shift ominously. Weather reports indicated a massive dust storm moving in from the southwest, a haboob that could reduce visibility to near zero and create wind shear conditions that would challenge even experienced pilots. Colonel Webb stood at the edge of the flight line, studying meteorological data on his tablet with the focused intensity of someone whose decisions carried life and death consequences. The exercise parameters were already aggressive. Pilots were required to complete a tactical approach pattern under simulated combat conditions, navigate through electronic warfare countermeasures that would scramble their instruments, and execute precision landings within predetermined time windows. "Gentlemen," he announced to the assembled pilots, his voice carrying over the increasing wind. "And lady," he added with what might have been an afterthought, "today's conditions have elevated this exercise from challenging to genuinely dangerous. Anyone who wants to stand down can do so without prejudice to their final evaluation." Elena felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes settling on her, waiting for her to take the offered exit. The smart play would be to defer. Nobody would question her judgment for avoiding flight operations in deteriorating weather conditions. But intelligence had never been enough to overcome the persistent suggestion that she didn't belong in this environment. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his characteristic swagger undimmed by the approaching storm. "With respect, sir, we didn't come this far to get spooked by a little wind. These conditions aren't any worse than what we'll face downrange." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Elena remained silent, but her decision had crystallized with absolute clarity. This was her moment, not just to prove she could fly the A-10, but to demonstrate that she could operate effectively under conditions that would separate competent pilots from exceptional ones. The takeoff sequence was staggered, with each pilot launching at 5-minute intervals to avoid congestion in the pattern. Morrison went first, his F-16 leaping off the runway with the aggressive acceleration that characterized high-performance fighters. Elena watched his aircraft disappear into the growing haze, noting how the visibility was degrading faster than the meteorological predictions had suggested. Her turn came after 45 minutes of waiting, during which the wind had increased to 25 knots with gusts approaching 40. The approaching haboob had created a wall of dust on the horizon that looked like a brown tsunami rolling across the desert landscape. Most civilian airports would have suspended operations under these conditions. Elena strapped into her A-10's cockpit with methodical precision, running through her pre-flight checklist while listening to radio chatter from pilots already in the pattern. Morrison's voice came through clearly, reporting moderate turbulence but manageable conditions. 2 other pilots had successfully completed their approach patterns, though both had required multiple attempts to achieve acceptable landing accuracy. The Warthog's twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, a sound that Elena had learned to interpret like a familiar voice. Today, the engines sounded strong and confident, their rhythm steady despite the crosswinds that were making the aircraft rock gently on its tricycle landing gear. Tower clearance came through her headset. "Thunderbolt 407, you're cleared for takeoff. Winds 240 at 28, gusting to 42. Visibility dropping rapidly. Abort criteria is 3 miles or less." Elena acknowledged the clearance and advanced the throttles, feeling the A-10's considerable mass overcome inertia as it began rolling down the runway. Unlike the nimble fighters her colleagues preferred, the Warthog required patience and respect. It accelerated steadily rather than dramatically, building energy that could be converted into devastating effectiveness once airborne. Liftoff came smoothly despite the gusty conditions, the A-10's low wing loading and stable design characteristics helping it punch through wind shear that might have challenged lighter aircraft. Elena climbed to pattern altitude and began the prescribed tactical approach sequence, but it was immediately obvious that conditions were deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. The dust storm hit with the sudden intensity of a natural disaster. Visibility dropped from 5 miles to less than 1 mile in the space of 2 minutes, and Elena found herself flying in an environment that resembled the inside of a sandblaster. Her instruments became critical lifelines as the outside world disappeared into a brown void that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. Radio chatter revealed the chaos that was developing around her. Morrison's confident voice had been replaced by tense concentration as he struggled with the F-16's sensitive flight controls in the turbulent air. 2 other pilots had already declared missed approaches, unable to maintain visual contact with the runway during their final approach segments. But Elena felt something unexpected happening. The conditions that were challenging other pilots felt almost familiar to her, like a harsh environment she'd been unconsciously preparing for her entire life. Her father's lessons about listening to machinery became invaluable as electronic displays flickered and failed under the assault of airborne dust and static electricity. The A-10's rugged construction proved its worth in conditions that revealed the limitations of more sophisticated aircraft. While other pilots fought to maintain control of sensitive, high-performance machines that demanded constant attention, Elena found herself in partnership with an aircraft that had been designed to operate in exactly these kinds of hostile environments. She could feel the Warthog's twin engines maintaining steady power despite ingesting enormous quantities of dust and debris. The flight controls remained responsive and predictable, the aircraft's inherent stability helping her maintain proper attitude and airspeed without the constant corrections required by more maneuverable designs. 20 minutes into the exercise, Elena made a decision that would define not just her evaluation, but her entire career. Instead of fighting the storm, she would use it. The Habub's intensity meant that traditional visual approach techniques were impossible, but it also created an opportunity to demonstrate skills that went beyond normal pilot training. She began her approach pattern, relying on instruments, instinct, and the mechanical sympathy her father had taught her to develop with machines that demanded respect rather than dominance. The tower frequency had gone largely quiet, broken only by occasional position reports from pilots struggling to maintain situational awareness in near-zero visibility. Elena's voice cut through the static with calm precision as she reported her position inbound for landing, her tone carrying none of the tension that had characterized other pilots' communications. Tower, Thunderbolt 407 is 5 miles out, runway in sight, requesting landing clearance. The response came immediately, tinged with disbelief. Thunderbolt 407, confirm you have visual contact with the runway? Current visibility is reported as less than half a mile. Affirmative, Tower. I have the runway environment in sight and am configured for landing. Elena's approach was poetry written in titanium and jet fuel. While other pilots had struggled to maintain stable approach parameters in the chaotic wind conditions, she seemed to have found a groove that worked with the turbulence rather than fighting against it. The A-10 descended steadily through the swirling dust, its pilot making minute control adjustments that kept the aircraft precisely on the optimum glide path. Colonel Webb stood in the tower facility, binoculars pressed to his eyes despite the limited visibility, watching the faint silhouette of Elena's aircraft materialize through the dust storm like a ghost becoming solid. Her approach angle was textbook perfect, her airspeed steady, her alignment with the runway centerline so precise it might have been computer-controlled. The landing was the kind that experienced pilots discussed in reverent tones, firm enough to be positive in the gusty conditions, but smooth enough to demonstrate absolute control. Elena's main gear touched down exactly at the 1,000-foot markers, her nose wheel settling onto the runway with the gentle precision of a surgeon's incision. As her A-10 rolled out and turned off the active runway, The radio crackled with activity. Morrison's voice, strained with concentration, reported that he was declaring a missed approach for the third time, unable to maintain visual reference during his final approach segment. Two other pilots had already returned to base at alternate airfields, their aircraft diverted due to the deteriorating conditions. Elena taxied to the parking area with the same methodical precision that had characterized her entire flight, shutting down her engines as ground crew members emerged from the operations building with expressions of amazement. The dust storm was still raging around them, but her A-10 sat on the ramp like it had simply materialized there by magic. Colonel Webb descended from the tower facility, his weathered face revealing an expression that Elena had never seen before. The casual dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like professional respect. He approached her aircraft as she completed her post-flight checklist, waiting patiently while she secured the cockpit and climbed down from the crew ladder. "Carter," he said simply, his voice carrying a weight that made other conversations on the flight line fall silent. Elena removed her helmet, revealing hair damp with perspiration and eyes that held the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just proven a point that had been years in the making. She didn't smile or celebrate. That wasn't her way. Instead, she looked directly at the colonel and waited for whatever judgment was coming. "That was exceptional flying," Webb continued, loud enough for the assembled ground crew and other personnel to hear clearly. "Exceptional flying under conditions that challenged pilots with twice your experience." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of an aircraft completing a successful landing in weather that had shut down operations across the entire southwestern United States. Elena noticed Captain Morrison among the observers, his earlier swagger replaced by something that might have been grudging admiration. "Sir," Elena replied, her voice steady and professional. "The aircraft performed exactly as designed. The A-10 is built for harsh conditions." Webb nodded slowly, but his eyes suggested he understood that the aircraft was only as good as the pilot controlling it. "Not any jet," he said, echoing his earlier dismissive comment with entirely different meaning. That jet. And not just anyone. A pause that seemed to acknowledge everything that had led to this moment. "You!" For the first time since arriving at Davis-Monthan, Elena allowed herself a small smile. The immediate aftermath of Elena's performance during the dust storm landing created ripple effects that extended far beyond her individual evaluation scores. Within hours, word had spread throughout Davis-Monthan Air Force Base and beyond, carried by the kind of informal communication networks that made military communities remarkably small and interconnected. The official recognition came first. Colonel Webb's final evaluation report contained language that Elena had never expected to see associated with her name. Exceptional performance under adverse conditions, demonstrated superior aeronautical decision-making, and recommended for immediate advancement to operational status. More importantly, she was assigned to the 354th Fighter Squadron, an operational A-10 unit preparing for deployment to Afghanistan. But the unofficial recognition proved even more meaningful. Captain Morrison, whose earlier mockery had epitomized the institutional skepticism Elena faced, sought her out in the officers' club 3 days after the evaluation. His approach was awkward, clearly uncomfortable, but genuine in a way that suggested real personal growth. "Look, Carter," he said, settling into the chair across from her small table. "I owe you an apology. More than an apology, actually. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about what it takes to be an effective pilot." Elena looked up from the technical manual she'd been studying, noting the sincerity in his expression. "We're good, Morrison. You didn't have all the information before. Now you do." "No," he insisted. "It's more than that. I was so focused on flashy flying and aggressive tactics that I missed something fundamental. You didn't just land that aircraft in impossible conditions. You made it look routine. That's not luck or political correctness. That's skill at a level I'm still trying to understand." Their conversation continued for over an hour, evolving from apology into genuine professional discussion about flying techniques, aircraft systems, and the different approaches pilots use to manage challenging situations. Elena found herself sharing insights about the A-10's capabilities that Morrison had never considered, while he offered perspectives on air-to-air combat that broadened her understanding of tactical aviation. The change in dynamic was emblematic of a broader shift occurring throughout the program. Elena's success had forced her colleagues to confront their assumptions about gender, capability, and what constituted effective piloting skills. Her methodical, technically precise approach to flying had proven just as valuable as the aggressive, instinctive style that traditionally characterized fighter pilots. More importantly, her story began attracting attention from outside the immediate military community. Aviation magazines published articles about the dust storm landing that made Elena uncomfortable with their focus on gender rather than technique. She preferred discussions that centered on the A-10's remarkable capabilities rather than her identity as a female pilot, but she recognized that visibility might help other women pursuing similar careers. Letters began arriving from young women across the country who had read about her achievement and wanted to know about opportunities in military aviation. Elena answered everyone personally, focusing on the technical requirements and educational pathways rather than inspirational platitudes. She wanted to encourage serious interest based on realistic understanding rather than romantic notions about military service. The most meaningful recognition came during her first operational deployment to Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. Elena's squadron was tasked with close air support missions that put her A-10's capabilities to their ultimate test. The aircraft that had been dismissed as obsolete by aviation purists proved devastatingly effective in supporting ground troops operating in mountainous terrain that challenged more sophisticated fighters. During her third month in-country, Elena received a message that brought tears to her eyes for the first time since her father's death. It was from a staff sergeant whose unit had been pinned down by Taliban fighters in a remote valley. Her A-10's precisely delivered ordnance had broken the engagement and allowed wounded soldiers to be evacuated safely. "Ma'am," the message read, "I don't care what aircraft you were flying or what anyone says about women in combat. You saved 8 American lives yesterday, and that's all that matters to any of us." That evening, Elena walked to the flight line at Bagram and stood beside her battle-scarred A-10. The aircraft's titanium skin showed the accumulated damage of dozens of combat missions, small holes from ground fire, scorch marks from close support missions, and the general weathering that came from operating in one of the world's harshest environments. She thought about her father's words about listening to machines, about Colonel Webb's dismissive comment that had started this journey, and about all the young women who might follow similar paths because someone had proven it was possible. "Dad," she whispered to the Afghan stars, "the sky remembers." How did this story touch you? If you've ever been underestimated but then proved your true worth, share your experience in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to HL Stories so you won't miss journeys that touch hearts like this one.